Welcome to a chapter a day. Most people believe their life changes when opportunity arrives, when the right door opens, when the right person appears, when luck finally turns in their favor. But if you study the lives of people who experience sudden breakthroughs, you'll notice something strange. Their lives didn't change when opportunity appeared. Their lives changed after a series of tests. Tests that looked nothing like success. Moments where things actually seemed to get worse. Moments where nothing seemed to move. Moments where quitting would have made perfect sense. And yet, those who passed those moments experienced something remarkable. Reality began to rearrange itself around them. New opportunities appeared. Unexpected help arrived. Ideas turned into outcomes. What if those difficult moments were never random? What if they were filters? Signals that you were approaching the edge of a new version of your life. Because here is a truth most people never realize. Before your reality expands, your character is tested. Before your opportunities grow, your patience is tested. Before your identity upgrades, your faith is tested. And the people who pass those tests often discover something powerful. Life begins responding to them differently. In this audiobook, you're going to discover the hidden tests that appear right before major life shifts. You'll understand why they happen, how most people unknowingly fail them, and how to recognize the moment when your life is quietly preparing to change. Because once you see these patterns, something incredible happens. You stop resisting the tests, and you start passing them. And when you pass them, reality begins to move. Chapter 1, Test 1. Things get harder before they get better. There is a moment that almost everyone experiences when they decide to improve their life. At first, the decision feels powerful. You feel motivated, focused, clear about the direction you want to go. You decide you're going to become more disciplined. You decide you're going to change your habits. You decide you're finally going to take control of your future. And for a brief moment, it feels like everything is aligned. But then something strange begins to happen. Instead of life becoming easier, it becomes harder. Suddenly, things that once felt manageable begin to feel heavier. Your motivation dips. Your routine feels uncomfortable. People around you seem confused by your changes. Sometimes, even the smallest tasks begin to feel like resistance. And this is the moment when many people quietly start to question themselves. They think, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this isn't the right time. Maybe I'm not meant for this. But here is something important that very few people realize. That moment is not a sign of failure. It is often the first test. And if you look closely at your own life, you may notice this pattern appearing again and again. Think about a time when you decided to improve something important. Maybe you committed to your health. Maybe you tried to build a business. Maybe you started working on your mindset. At first, the decision felt empowering. But shortly after that decision, new challenges appeared. Unexpected stress, doubt, discomfort. It almost felt as if life suddenly became more complicated the moment you tried to grow. And because this experience is so common, many people interpret it the same way. They assume something is going wrong. But what if the opposite is true? What if that moment of increased difficulty is actually evidence that something is beginning to shift? Pause for a moment and think about this. Your life is built around patterns. Patterns of behavior. Patterns of thinking. Patterns of reacting to situations. These patterns create a sense of familiarity for your mind. Your brain becomes comfortable with the identity you've been living, even if that identity includes stress, even if it includes procrastination, even if it includes limitation, because the brain has a very specific priority. Not happiness, not success. Its primary goal is stability, predictability, familiarity. And when you suddenly decide to grow beyond the patterns your brain recognizes, something inside you begins to resist. Not because growth is wrong, but because growth introduces uncertainty. and the mind prefers a predictable problem over an unfamiliar opportunity. This is why the moment you begin changing your habits, resistance appears. The moment you start taking your goals seriously, life seems to become more demanding. The moment you commit to becoming a different person, your old identity begins to push back. You may not notice this immediately, but it appears in subtle ways. You wake up with less motivation than expected. Distractions become more appealing. Old habits suddenly feel more comfortable again. And sometimes, external challenges appear that test your patience. Unexpected problems, unexpected criticism, unexpected delays, all arriving at the exact moment you decided to move forward. But here is the key insight. These moments are not random. They are often the mind's way of asking a very simple question. Are you serious about becoming someone new? Or was that decision temporary? Because transformation always begins with friction. It begins with discomfort. It begins with pressure. And pressure is something many people misunderstand. Most people interpret pressure as something negative, something to avoid, something that means things are going wrong. But if you observe how growth actually works in the world, you begin to see something different. Seeds grow under pressure from the soil above them. Muscles grow through the pressure of resistance. Diamonds form through extreme pressure over time. Pressure, in many cases, is simply the environment where expansion begins, which leads us to a powerful realization. Pressure is often the final stage before expansion. Let that idea settle in your mind for a moment. Pressure is often the final stage before expansion. Think about how many people quit during that exact moment. They experience resistance. They feel the discomfort. They interpret it as failure. And they return to the familiar patterns their mind understands. Not because they lack potential, but because they misunderstood the test. They believed the resistance meant they were not ready. But in many cases, resistance appears precisely because they are ready, because something inside them has begun to change. And change always disrupts the equilibrium of your current life. Imagine two people standing at the same moment of pressure. Both decided to improve their lives. Both encounter unexpected difficulty. Both feel doubt creeping into their mind. But their interpretations are different. The first person thinks, "This must mean I'm not meant for this." So they slow down. They hesitate. They eventually stop. And life returns to its familiar rhythm. The second person thinks something very different. They think, "This must be the test." So instead of stopping, they keep moving. Not perfectly, not confidently every moment, but consistently. And slowly, something interesting begins to happen. The resistance weakens. The discomfort becomes manageable. The habits begin to stabilize. And eventually, what once felt difficult begins to feel normal. Because the mind has accepted the new identity, the new pattern, the new version of you. And this is one of the quiet truths about transformation that very few people talk about. The hardest part is not the work itself. The hardest part is surviving the moment when the old version of you tries to return, when your previous habits invite you back, when your previous thinking tries to convince you that the effort isn't worth it. But the moment you move through that pressure, something powerful happens. You begin proving something to yourself. You prove that discomfort does not control your direction. You prove that resistance does not define your limits. You prove that growth is possible even when it feels difficult. And those proofs begin to reshape your identity. Because identity is not formed by intentions. Identity is formed by repeated evidence. Each time you continue despite difficulty, you create new evidence. Evidence that you are someone who persists. Evidence that you are someone who grows. Evidence that you are someone who does not retreat the moment pressure appears. And over time, those small moments accumulate. They begin forming a new internal story. A story where challenges are not warnings. They are signals. Signals that something important is happening. signals that your life may be preparing for expansion, which is why the people who experience the most powerful breakthroughs often describe a similar pattern. Right before things improved, things became difficult. Right before the opportunity appeared, there was a period of uncertainty. Right before the breakthrough, there was pressure, because pressure is often the final stage before expansion. And once you begin recognizing this pattern in your life, something changes in the way you respond to difficulty. Instead of immediately assuming something is wrong, you pause. You observe the moment differently. You ask yourself a new question. Is this the test? Because when you ask that question, the experience changes. The challenge becomes meaningful. The pressure becomes purposeful. And suddenly, you are no longer reacting to the difficulty. You are learning from it, growing through it, moving forward in spite of it. Which brings us to another realization. Sometimes the most important progress in your life is invisible at first. It happens inside your thinking, inside your reactions, inside the quiet moments when you decide not to give up. And those internal shifts eventually begin shaping your external reality. But that leads us to the next test that many people face on the path to transformation. Because sometimes the challenge is not that things become harder. Sometimes the challenge is something even more frustrating. Sometimes, nothing seems to change at all. You've learned to move through pressure. You've stayed consistent. You've kept showing up. But the results you expected still haven't appeared. And that experience can test a person's patience more than any obstacle. Which is why the next test is one that quietly causes many people to abandon their progress. Not because they lack effort, but because they misunderstand what is happening beneath the surface. You've learned how to face pressure. Now, let's talk about what happens when progress becomes invisible. Chapter 2. Test 2. Nothing seems to change. There is a particular phase in every meaningful transformation that almost nobody prepares you for. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. In fact, it is almost invisible. It is the phase where you are doing the work. You are showing up. You are thinking differently. You are trying to become more disciplined. You are trying to improve your habits. And yet, from the outside, it appears that absolutely nothing has changed. Days pass. Weeks pass. Sometimes even months pass. And the results you expected are nowhere to be seen. You wake up early. You stay consistent. You try to keep your focus. But the reward you imagined feels delayed. And this is one of the most dangerous moments in any journey of growth. Not because the effort is failing, but because the mind begins to create a very convincing story. It begins whispering a simple thought. This isn't working. That quiet thought slowly grows louder. You begin comparing your progress to others. You begin wondering if the effort is worth it. You begin asking yourself whether you should return to the way things used to be. And if we are honest, most people do exactly that. Not because they lack discipline, not because they lack ambition, but because they misunderstand what is happening during this phase. Because when nothing appears to be changing on the outside, something important is often changing on the inside. And that internal shift is where real transformation begins. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. Imagine planting a seed in the ground. You water it. You protect it. You make sure the soil is healthy. But for days, nothing appears. Then weeks pass. Still nothing. From the outside, it would be easy to assume the seed has failed. But beneath the surface, something quiet is happening. Roots are forming. The structure that will support the future plant is slowly developing underground. And without those roots, the plant would never survive once it emerges. Human growth follows a very similar pattern. When you begin changing your life, the first changes rarely appear in your circumstances. They appear in your thinking. Your reactions begin to shift. Your awareness expands. Your habits slowly begin to stabilize. You start making slightly different decisions. And at first, those changes feel almost insignificant. But over time, they accumulate. Your morning routine becomes consistent. Your focus becomes stronger. Your ability to resist distractions improves. You become calmer in situations that once triggered stress. These are quiet victories, invisible victories, but they are building the foundation for something larger. Because external results are almost always the final stage of a much longer internal process. Think about someone learning a new skill. At the beginning, progress feels painfully slow. The mind struggles to understand the new patterns. Mistakes happen constantly. Confidence is low. But something interesting is happening inside the brain. Neural pathways are forming. Connections are strengthening. The brain is literally rewiring itself to support the new ability. And during that phase, progress often feels invisible. Yet that invisible progress is precisely what eventually produces visible mastery. The same principle applies to every area of life. When you begin transforming your identity, the early stages are subtle. You are no longer the same person you used to be. But the external world has not caught up to that change yet. And this delay can feel frustrating, because the human mind naturally seeks immediate feedback. We want to see proof that our effort matters. We want confirmation that we are moving in the right direction. But life does not always provide that confirmation right away. Sometimes growth happens quietly. Sometimes progress happens beneath the surface. Sometimes transformation is occurring in ways that cannot yet be measured. And during those moments, patience becomes one of the most important qualities you can develop. Because patience allows you to continue moving forward even when the reward has not appeared yet. And here is something fascinating about people who eventually experience major breakthroughs. Almost all of them went through a long period where nothing seemed to change. Athletes train for years before their performance suddenly improves. Entrepreneurs work behind the scenes long before their success becomes visible. Writers spend countless hours refining their ideas before their message reaches the world. From the outside, it often appears as though success happened suddenly. But in reality, the progress was building slowly and quietly long before anyone noticed. This is what makes the second test so powerful. Because the moment when nothing seems to change is the moment when many people lose faith. They stop watering the seed. They abandon the process. They convince themselves the effort was pointless. But those who pass this test understand something deeper. They understand that growth is happening even when results are quiet. Let that idea settle into your mind. Growth is happening even when results are quiet. Every day you remain consistent, something is changing. Your discipline strengthens. Your identity evolves. Your standards rise. Your thinking becomes clearer. And those changes eventually begin influencing the opportunities that appear in your life. Because the world responds differently to people who carry themselves differently. When your mindset shifts, your behavior shifts. When your behavior shifts, your decisions shift. And when your decisions shift, your future begins to change. But those changes rarely appear instantly. They emerge gradually, quietly, sometimes in ways you don't recognize until much later. And that is why this phase requires trust. Trust in the process. Trust in your growth. Trust in the idea that effort compounded over time eventually creates momentum. Momentum is one of the most powerful forces in life. At first, it feels non-existent. But once it begins building, everything starts moving faster. Opportunities appear more frequently. Confidence increases. Results become visible. And suddenly, the progress that once felt invisible begins to accelerate. But that acceleration only happens for those who stayed consistent during the quiet phase. The phase where nothing seemed to change. The phase where patience was tested. The phase where belief mattered more than immediate results. Because belief is what keeps a person moving when evidence has not yet appeared. And when belief and action continue long enough, Reality eventually catches up. This is one of the quiet laws of growth. Internal alignment precedes external transformation. First, your thinking changes. Then your habits change. Then your behavior changes. And finally, your life begins to change. But the delay between those stages is what tests people the most. It is the moment where doubt begins whispering again. The moment where impatience begins creeping into your thoughts. The moment where the mind begins asking questions like, why is this taking so long? Maybe this isn't working. Maybe I should give up. And that moment brings us to another important realization. The tests you experience during growth are rarely about ability. They are about endurance. They are about your willingness to continue when results are delayed. Your willingness to stay consistent when progress is quiet. Your willingness to believe in the process even when the evidence is still forming. And the people who pass this test eventually discover something remarkable. One day, the results begin to appear. The opportunity arrives. The breakthrough happens. The progress becomes visible. And others look at their success and assume it happened suddenly. But they know the truth. They know that success was quietly growing beneath the surface long before anyone noticed. Which is why the second test is not about results. It is about patience. It is about learning to trust that growth is happening even when results are quiet. Because the moment you truly understand this, you stop measuring progress only by what you can see. You begin measuring progress by who you are becoming. And once that shift happens, something powerful changes inside you. You no longer panic when results take time. You no longer assume that silence means failure. You simply continue moving forward. Calm, focused, patient. But as your patience grows, another test often begins to appear. Because when progress takes time, when results are delayed, when the journey feels uncertain, something else starts speaking inside your mind. A voice that begins asking difficult questions. A voice that challenges your belief. A voice that introduces a familiar emotion. Doubt. And learning how to face that voice becomes the next critical step in this journey. You've learned to move through pressure. You've learned to trust the process when progress feels invisible. Now it's time to confront the voice that appears when belief is tested. Chapter 3. Test 3. Doubt gets louder. There is a moment on every meaningful path where the challenge is no longer external. It becomes internal. You've already faced the pressure that appears when things get harder. You've already experienced the quiet phase where nothing seems to change. But then another voice begins to appear. A quieter voice. A more personal one. Doubt. It does not always arrive suddenly. Most of the time, it enters slowly. At first, it sounds like a simple question. Are you sure this will work? Then the questions become more frequent. What if you're wasting your time? What if you're not capable of this? What if everyone else can see something you can't? And the strange thing about doubt is that it can feel very convincing. Because the mind is incredibly skilled at constructing logical reasons for hesitation. It gathers evidence. It remembers past failures. It highlights risks. It paints pictures of what could go wrong. And before long, doubt can begin to feel like wisdom. But there is something important you must understand about this moment. Doubt often appears precisely when you are approaching unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory is where transformation lives. Think about two people who begin the exact same journey. Both decide they want something more from life. Both commit to growing, improving, expanding beyond their current limits. At the beginning, their experiences look very similar. They both feel motivated. They both imagine the future they want. They both take the first steps forward. But eventually, the same voice appears in both of their minds. Doubt. The first person hears that voice and interprets it as a warning. They think, maybe this doubt is a sign that I shouldn't continue. Maybe this feeling means I'm not ready. Maybe this path is not meant for me. So they slow down. They hesitate. They begin retreating toward the familiar patterns they used to live in. And eventually, they convince themselves that their decision to grow was unrealistic. But the second person hears that same voice and interprets it differently. They recognize doubt for what it actually is, a signal that they are stepping into something unfamiliar. They understand that the brain does not naturally embrace uncertainty. It protects familiarity, even when familiarity includes limitation, even when familiarity includes dissatisfaction, because the mind is designed to preserve stability. And when you begin challenging the identity you've lived with for years, the mind reacts. It questions. It resists. It tries to guide you back toward what it understands. This reaction often takes the form of doubt. But here is the psychological twist that changes everything once you see it clearly. Doubt is not proof that something is wrong. It is evidence that your mind is confronting unfamiliar territory. Let that idea settle for a moment. Doubt is not proof that something is wrong. It is evidence that your mind is confronting unfamiliar territory. Think about the first time you learned something new. Maybe it was learning to drive. Maybe it was speaking in front of a group. Maybe it was starting a new job. At the beginning, everything feels uncertain. You question your ability. You second-guess your decisions. You wonder whether you will succeed. But as time passes and experience grows, something interesting happens. Confidence begins to appear. Not because someone handed it to you, but because your mind received proof. Proof that you could handle the situation. Proof that your abilities were growing. Proof that the unfamiliar was slowly becoming familiar. This reveals something important about confidence. Confidence rarely appears before action. It appears after proof. Yet many people wait for confidence before they act. They believe they need to feel ready before moving forward. But readiness is often created by movement itself. Action creates experience. Experience creates understanding. Understanding creates confidence. And confidence eventually replaces doubt. But that process can only begin if you move forward despite the uncertainty, despite the hesitation, despite the voice that suggests you should wait. Because if you wait for doubt to disappear completely, you may end up waiting forever. The people who eventually experience extraordinary changes in their lives are not the ones who never feel doubt. They are the ones who understand how to move forward while doubt is still present. They treat doubt like background noise instead of a command. They hear the voice, but they don't obey it. And something fascinating happens when you begin behaving this way. Doubt slowly loses its power. It becomes quieter, less convincing, less intimidating, because your actions begin producing evidence that challenges the story doubt was telling. Each step forward becomes proof. Proof that you are capable. Proof that growth is possible. Proof that uncertainty does not have to control your decisions. And over time, that proof reshapes the way you see yourself. You stop identifying as someone who hesitates. You begin identifying as someone who moves forward anyway. Someone who explores possibilities. Someone who is willing to learn through experience rather than fear. And that identity shift changes everything. Because your life does not only respond to what you want, it responds to who you believe you are. If you believe you are someone who avoids risk, your behavior will reflect that belief. If you believe you are someone who grows through challenge, your actions will begin reflecting that identity as well. Which is why doubt often appears right before identity expansion. Your mind is adjusting to the possibility that you may become someone different, someone more capable, someone more confident, someone who does not allow fear to define their path. And when that possibility appears, the mind tests it. It asks difficult questions. It introduces uncertainty. It challenges your belief, not to stop you, but to see whether your commitment is real. Because growth requires more than intention. It requires resilience. Resilience in the presence of pressure. Resilience in the presence of silence. resilience in the presence of doubt. And every time you continue moving forward despite that doubt, something inside you strengthens. Your self-trust grows. Your courage expands. Your identity evolves. You begin realizing that doubt is not the enemy. It is simply a companion that appears whenever you step beyond the known. And the moment you understand that truth, doubt loses its ability to control you. Instead of stopping you, it reminds you that you are entering new territory. Territory where learning happens. Territory where growth happens. Territory where the next version of your life is waiting to be built. But as you continue moving forward, something else begins to shift as well. Your thinking changes. Your habits change. Your priorities change. And when those internal shifts happen, another test often appears in your life. It does not always come from inside your mind. Sometimes it comes from the people around you. Because when you begin evolving, not everyone in your environment evolves with you. Some people become uncomfortable with your changes. Some relationships begin to feel different. Some connections quietly fade. And this experience can feel confusing if you are not prepared for it. But once you understand the pattern, it becomes another signal of transformation. You've learned how to recognize pressure. You've learned how to trust the process when results are quiet. You've learned how to move forward even when doubt speaks loudly. Now it's time to understand what happens when your growth begins changing the environment around you. Chapter 4, Test 4. The wrong people start leaving. There is a moment in every transformation that feels surprisingly emotional. It's not about your goals. It's not about your habits. It's about the people around you. Because as you begin changing your life, something subtle begins to happen in your relationships. Conversations feel different. Some people seem less interested in the things you're working toward. Some interactions that once felt easy begin to feel tense. And sometimes people who were once close slowly drift away. At first, this can feel confusing. You may wonder if you've done something wrong. You may question whether your growth has somehow created distance between you and others. You might even feel tempted to shrink yourself just a little, just to restore the comfort that once existed. But if you look closely at the patterns of personal growth, you will notice something important. This experience is incredibly common. It happens quietly to almost everyone who begins evolving beyond their previous identity. And the reason it happens is both simple and profound. Growth changes alignment. When you change the way you think, when you change the way you spend your time, when you change your priorities, your environment naturally begins shifting as well. Not because you are rejecting people, and not because they are bad for you, but because alignment is changing. Think about the people who were part of your life years ago. Some of them are still present. Others naturally faded as your life moved in new directions. This happens in every stage of life. Childhood friendships evolve. Work environments change. New opportunities introduce new connections. And old connections sometimes fade without conflict. But when personal transformation happens intentionally, the shift can feel more noticeable. Because your inner world begins changing faster than your outer environment. You start thinking differently. You start seeing possibilities where you once saw limits. You begin spending time on things that matter more deeply to your future. And those shifts influence the energy you bring into every interaction. Some people feel inspired by that energy. They become curious. They grow alongside you. But others may feel something different. They may feel uncomfortable. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your growth reminds them of possibilities they may not be ready to explore themselves. And that discomfort sometimes creates distance. Sometimes it appears as skepticism. Sometimes it appears as criticism. And sometimes it simply appears as silence. This can be difficult if you interpret it as rejection. But once you understand the deeper pattern, your perspective begins to change. Because here is a truth that many people discover on the path of transformation. Not everyone in your current life is aligned with your future life. Let that thought settle gently. Not everyone in your current life is aligned with your future life. That realization is not meant to create judgment. It is meant to create clarity. Because every stage of life carries its own environment, its own conversations, its own energy. And when you rise to a new level of thinking, your environment must eventually adjust to support that level. Imagine trying to build a new life while remaining surrounded only by the patterns that shaped your old one. The conflict would be constant. Your goals would pull you forward while your environment quietly pulled you backward. This is why environments matter so much in the process of growth. They reinforce identity. They normalize behavior. They shape expectations. If everyone around you avoids risk, taking bold action feels strange. If everyone around you complains about limitations, dreaming bigger feels uncomfortable. But when you begin surrounding yourself with people who think differently, something powerful happens. Your perspective expands. Your ambitions feel normal instead of unrealistic. Your progress accelerates. And this brings us to an important principle that appears again and again in the lives of people who evolve. Every new level requires a different environment. Sometimes that environment includes new ideas. Sometimes it includes new habits. And sometimes it includes new people. But the shift does not always happen dramatically. Most of the time, it happens quietly. A conversation that once lasted hours now ends quickly. A relationship that once felt natural now feels slightly distant. A connection that once dominated your time gradually becomes less central. At first, you may feel tempted to resist this change. You may try to hold on to every relationship exactly as it once was. But growth rarely works that way. Transformation requires space. Space for new perspectives. Space for new opportunities. Space for new connections that align with the person you are becoming. And when you allow that space to exist, something interesting begins to happen. New people begin entering your life. People who share your focus. People who understand your direction. People who encourage the version of yourself you are building. These connections often appear gradually, through shared interests, through shared goals, through environments that support growth. And over time, you realize something important. You didn't lose people. Your life simply realigned. Because growth is not about abandoning relationships. It is about allowing your environment to evolve with your identity. And sometimes that means some connections naturally fade. Not through conflict, not through resentment, but through the quiet movement of life itself. When you begin seeing this process clearly, the emotional weight begins to lift. You stop interpreting distance as failure. You stop believing that every relationship must remain unchanged forever. Instead, you begin appreciating each connection for the role it played in your journey. Some people were meant to walk with you for a long time. Others were meant to share a chapter. And every chapter contributes something valuable to your story. But your responsibility is not to freeze your life in one chapter. Your responsibility is to continue growing, to continue evolving, to continue becoming the person capable of living the life you are building. And when you honor that responsibility, your environment naturally begins aligning with your future rather than your past. This is another one of the hidden tests that appear before reality begins to shift. Because the moment you allow your environment to evolve, you demonstrate something powerful. You demonstrate commitment to your growth. You show that your vision for your future is stronger than your attachment to familiarity. And that commitment creates momentum. Momentum that begins shaping the opportunities and experiences that enter your life. But just as you begin adjusting to this new alignment, another challenge often appears. Because sometimes, even when you're doing the work, even when you're growing, even when your environment is shifting, life seems to slow down in unexpected ways. Plans take longer than expected. Opportunities pause. Progress feels delayed. And these delays can test your patience more than almost anything else. Which is why the next test is one that many people misunderstand completely. You've learned how to move through pressure. You've learned how to stay consistent when progress feels invisible. You've learned how to move forward even when doubt appears. You've learned how to allow your environment to evolve as you grow. Now it's time to understand what happens when life itself seems to slow the process down. Chapter 5. Test 5. Unexpected delays appear. There is a stage in every meaningful journey where progress seems to slow down. Not gradually, but suddenly. You begin with energy and direction. You make plans. You take action. You imagine how the next few months will unfold. And for a while, everything seems to move forward. But then something unexpected happens. The timeline stretches. A project takes longer than expected. An opportunity that seemed certain suddenly pauses. A door that looked ready to open remains closed. And the momentum you felt in the beginning begins to feel uncertain. If you've ever experienced this moment, you know how frustrating it can be. Because in your mind, you've already imagined what progress should look like. You have a mental picture of the path. You expect effort to produce results within a reasonable time. And when that expectation isn't met, the mind begins asking difficult questions. Why is this taking so long? Did I make a mistake? Maybe this was never meant to happen. And those questions can slowly erode the confidence you built earlier in the journey. Because delays create a unique kind of pressure. Not the intense pressure of immediate obstacles, but the quiet pressure of waiting. Waiting for movement. Waiting for confirmation, waiting for the next step to reveal itself. And for many people, waiting feels unbearable. We live in a world that celebrates speed, fast results, instant feedback, immediate progress. But real transformation rarely follows that timeline. In fact, many of the most meaningful breakthroughs in life include long periods of delay. Periods where progress appears to pause. Where opportunities remain just out of reach, where the future feels uncertain. And if you look closely at those moments, you'll notice something interesting. Those delays often appear right before something significant begins to shift. But during the delay itself, it rarely feels that way. During the delay, it feels like stagnation, like lost time, like frustration, because the human mind struggles with one particular emotion more than almost anything else. Uncertainty. When you know what to do next, action feels possible. But when the path becomes unclear, the mind begins searching for explanations. And often it assumes the worst. But what if those delays are not obstacles? What if they are part of the preparation? Think about how many things in life require time before they can fully develop. A musician practices for years before performing confidently. A scientist studies for decades before making a discovery. A tree grows slowly for many seasons before it becomes strong enough to withstand storms. In each of these cases, the visible result appears much later than the invisible preparation that made it possible. The same principle often applies to your life. When you are building something meaningful, whether it's a career, a mindset, a skill, or a new identity, the process rarely moves in a straight line. There are moments of rapid progress, and there are moments where everything slows down. But those slower moments often carry an important purpose. They force you to prepare more deeply. They give you time to refine your thinking. They create space for strategy instead of reaction. Because when progress is fast, it's easy to move without reflection. But when progress pauses, you begin examining things more carefully. You begin asking better questions. You begin strengthening the foundation beneath your ambitions. And that deeper preparation often becomes the very reason future success becomes sustainable. Consider the difference between something that grows quickly and something that grows steadily. Quick growth can be exciting, but without strong foundations, it can collapse just as quickly. Steady growth, on the other hand, builds resilience. It builds understanding. It builds strength. And delays often play a role in creating that steady growth. They force patience. They encourage clarity. They create time for skills to develop and perspectives to mature. Which is why many people eventually look back at their delays with a completely different understanding. What once felt like wasted time begins to reveal itself as preparation. The extra months allowed them to learn something crucial. The unexpected pause helped them avoid a mistake. The delay strengthened their mindset in ways they did not appreciate at the time. And once they see the full picture, they realize something remarkable. The delay was not working against them. It was working for them. But this realization usually comes later. Much later. During the delay itself, patience becomes the most important skill. And patience is not simply the ability to wait. It is the ability to remain calm and focused while you wait. It is the ability to trust that movement will eventually return. It is the ability to continue preparing even when progress is not immediately visible. This kind of patience is powerful because it prevents emotional reactions from disrupting your long-term vision. When delays appear, some people panic. They rush decisions. They abandon plans. They chase shortcuts that promise faster results. But those shortcuts often lead them away from the very path they were building. Patience protects you from that reaction. It allows you to stay aligned with your direction. It allows you to continue building quietly while others grow frustrated. And over time, that patience becomes one of your greatest advantages. Because while others stop during delays, you continue preparing. While others become discouraged, you continue refining. While others assume nothing is happening, you continue strengthening the foundation beneath your future. And when momentum finally returns, you are ready for it. This is why delays appear so often in stories of transformation. They are not interruptions. They are intervals. Intervals that give you time to become the person capable of sustaining the success you are seeking. Because success without preparation can become overwhelming. Opportunities without readiness can become wasted. But when preparation and opportunity meet at the right moment, something powerful happens. Momentum begins. Real progress begins. And the path forward becomes clearer than it was before. This is why it is so important to remember a simple phrase during moments of delay. A delay is often preparation in disguise. A delay is often preparation in disguise. The opportunity has not disappeared. The process has not failed. The timeline has simply expanded to allow deeper preparation. And when you understand this truth, delays stop feeling like punishment. They begin feeling like investment. Investment in your patience. Investment in your perspective. Investment in the future version of yourself that will eventually handle the opportunities that arrive. And those opportunities will arrive. Because growth always continues moving forward, even when the pace temporarily slows. But as you move through these delays and continue preparing, another test begins to emerge. A test that comes from within. Because even as your life begins shifting, something inside you may begin pulling you backward. Old habits resurface. Old fears whisper again. Old identities try to reclaim control. And that internal struggle becomes the next challenge you must understand. You've faced pressure. You've stayed consistent through invisible progress. You've learned how to move forward despite doubt. You've allowed your environment to evolve. You've practiced patience through delays. Now it's time to confront something deeper. The version of yourself you used to be. Because before your new life fully arrives, the old identity often makes one final attempt to return. Chapter 6, Test 6. Your old identity fights back. There is a moment in the journey of transformation that surprises many people. It arrives quietly, and at first it feels confusing, because after everything you've already faced, the pressure, the silence, the doubt, the changing environment, the unexpected delays, you might expect things to finally become easier. But instead, something strange begins to happen. Old habits begin to reappear. Old thoughts return. Old patterns quietly try to pull you backward. You may notice yourself procrastinating again. You may feel an urge to return to the comforts you once tried to leave behind. You might even catch yourself thinking thoughts that sound very familiar. Thoughts like, maybe I should just go back to the way things were. Maybe this new version of me is too difficult to maintain. Maybe the old path wasn't so bad after all. If you've ever experienced this moment, you are not alone. In fact, it happens to almost everyone who gets close to real change. And it reveals something incredibly important about the way the human mind works. The mind does not simply adapt to change instantly. It protects identity. Your brain has spent years learning the patterns of the person you have been. It has memorized your routines, your reactions, your comfort zones, your beliefs about what is possible and what is not. That collection of patterns becomes something powerful. Your identity. An identity acts like a blueprint for behavior. It quietly influences how you think, how you react, what you believe you deserve, and most importantly, what you believe you are capable of becoming. So when you begin transforming your life, something fascinating happens. You are not just changing your habits. You are challenging the blueprint your mind has been protecting. And when the mind senses that the blueprint is changing, it reacts. Not because it wants you to fail, but because its primary mission is stability, predictability, familiarity, even if that familiarity includes limitations. Which means the moment you begin stepping into a new identity, the old identity often pushes back. This pushback can appear in many forms. Sometimes it shows up as procrastination. Sometimes it shows up as fear. Sometimes it appears as self-sabotage. You get close to an opportunity and suddenly hesitate. You make progress and then find a way to disrupt your own momentum. You take steps forward and then unconsciously create reasons to slow down. At first, this behavior can feel frustrating. You may wonder why you are resisting something you genuinely want. But once you understand the mechanism behind it, the pattern becomes clear. The brain protects the identity it believes you are. If your identity says you are someone who plays small, taking big action feels uncomfortable. If your identity says you are someone who avoids risk, bold decisions trigger anxiety. If your identity says you are someone who struggles, success may even feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar experiences often trigger resistance, not because they are dangerous, but because they do not match the blueprint your mind recognizes. This is why identity change is one of the most powerful forms of transformation. Because when identity shifts, behavior follows naturally. Think about someone who identifies as an athlete. They don't force themselves to exercise. Exercise simply feels consistent with who they believe they are. Think about someone who identifies as a disciplined person. Waking up early is not a battle. It is simply part of their identity. But when identity and behavior are misaligned, tension appears. You want to move forward, but something inside you hesitates. You want to grow, but something inside you resists. And that resistance is often the old identity trying to protect itself. Which is why the sixth test is so important. Because this is the moment where many people unknowingly return to their old patterns. Not because they lack ambition, but because they never fully replaced their old identity. They tried to change behavior without changing belief. But the truth is simple. Your life follows the identity you defend. If you defend the identity of someone who struggles, struggle becomes familiar. If you defend the identity of someone who grows, growth becomes natural. The question is not simply what you want from life. The deeper question is, who do you believe you are? Because that belief quietly shapes every decision you make. When you believe you are capable, you approach opportunities differently. When you believe you are resilient, challenges feel manageable. When you believe you are evolving, temporary setbacks no longer define your direction. Identity shapes perception. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes results. Which means the most powerful shift you can make is not just in what you do, but in who you believe you are becoming. This shift rarely happens overnight. It happens through repetition, through evidence, through small actions that gradually reinforce a new story about yourself. Every time you continue moving forward despite resistance, you send a signal to your mind. Every time you choose discipline over distraction, you send another signal. Every time you act in alignment with your future rather than your past, you strengthen the new identity. And slowly, the old blueprint begins to fade. The hesitation becomes quieter. The resistance weakens. The new version of yourself begins to feel natural instead of forced. Eventually, the behaviors that once felt difficult become automatic. And when that happens, your life begins changing more rapidly than before. Because identity-driven behavior is incredibly powerful. It creates consistency without constant effort. It creates momentum without constant motivation. And momentum is what eventually carries people into the reality they once imagined. But the transition between identities is rarely comfortable. There is always a period where the old self and the new self compete for influence. A moment where the familiar past tries to reclaim control. And the people who pass this test are not the ones who never feel that tension. They are the ones who recognize it. They notice the voice of the old identity. They acknowledge it, but they do not allow it to define their decisions. Instead, they continue reinforcing the person they are becoming. And with every decision that supports that new identity, the future begins to feel more real. The next level of life begins to feel attainable. The path becomes clearer. But as identity strengthens and growth continues, another surprising test often appears. Because sometimes the opportunities that change your life do not arrive looking like opportunities. Sometimes they appear disguised as problems, unexpected responsibilities, unexpected challenges, unexpected situations that initially feel inconvenient or difficult. And recognizing those moments becomes the next crucial step in this journey. You have faced pressure. You have moved through silence. You have continued despite doubt. You have allowed your environment to evolve. You have practiced patience through delays. You have begun reshaping your identity. Now it's time to recognize the moments when opportunity arrives wearing a disguise. Chapter 7. Test 7. Opportunities appear disguised as problems. There is a moment in nearly every success story that at the time it happened did not look like success at all. It looked like inconvenience. It looked like pressure. Sometimes it even looked like a problem. If you ask people to describe the moment their lives began to change, many of them will not talk about a perfect opportunity arriving at the perfect time. They will talk about something unexpected, a situation they did not plan for, a responsibility they did not ask for, a challenge they initially wished had never appeared. And yet, when they look back years later, they realize something extraordinary. That moment, the one that felt inconvenient, was actually the doorway. But the doorway did not look like a doorway. It looked like a wall. This is one of the most misunderstood patterns in personal growth and achievement. We imagine that opportunity will arrive clearly labeled. We imagine it will appear with excitement, clarity, and confidence. We imagine it will feel obvious. But in reality, opportunity often arrives wearing a disguise. Sometimes the disguise is responsibility. Someone asks you to take on something difficult, something uncomfortable, something that requires you to grow faster than you expected. Your first instinct might be hesitation. You might think, I'm not ready for this. But hidden inside that responsibility is something powerful. Expansion. Other times, opportunity arrives disguised as a problem. A project fails. A plan collapses. A situation forces you to rethink everything. At the moment it happens, it feels like a setback. But later, you realize that the collapse forced you to build something stronger, something better aligned with the person you are becoming. Many businesses were born from a problem someone was determined to solve. Many careers began when someone stepped forward during a moment of uncertainty. Many breakthroughs started with the simple decision to handle something that others avoided. Because growth rarely waits for perfect timing. It appears in moments that test your willingness to respond. Think about how often the greatest growth in your life has come from something unexpected. Not from comfort, not from ease, but from situations that forced you to adapt. Situations that demanded more from you. Situations that required courage. Those moments rarely feel like opportunities while they are happening. They feel heavy. They feel inconvenient. They feel like obstacles standing directly in your path. But obstacles have a unique quality. They force movement. They force problem solving. They force creativity. And sometimes the obstacle itself becomes the path forward. The doorway often looks like a wall. When people miss opportunities, it is often because they were waiting for something easier, something clearer, something that looked more like the image they had in their mind. But the most meaningful opportunities rarely match our expectations. They challenge us. They stretch us. They introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. Yet uncertainty is also where transformation happens. Because in uncertain moments, you are no longer operating from routine. You are forced to think differently. You are forced to act differently. You are forced to discover abilities you may not have realized you possessed. This is why many of the most influential leaders, creators, and innovators share a similar experience. Their breakthrough began when they said yes to something that initially looked like a burden, a project others ignored, a challenge others avoided, a responsibility others rejected. They stepped forward when stepping forward was inconvenient, and that decision changed everything. What looked like extra work became visibility. What looked like a problem became a solution others valued. What looked like pressure became preparation, because pressure reveals capacity, and capacity reveals potential. When you begin to recognize this pattern, something remarkable happens. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And you start asking a much more powerful question. What could this be preparing me for? That question changes everything. Instead of resisting the moment, you become curious about it. Instead of avoiding the challenge, you explore it. Instead of seeing a wall, you begin searching for the doorway hidden within it. And sometimes, the doorway only appears after you begin pushing against the wall. Sometimes the opportunity only reveals itself once you commit to solving the problem. Because effort often exposes possibilities that hesitation cannot see. This is why perspective matters so much during moments of difficulty. Two people can face the same challenge and experience completely different outcomes. One sees only the problem. The other sees potential. One withdraws. The other leans forward. One waits for clarity. The other creates it. And over time, those small differences in perspective lead to dramatically different results. Opportunities are not always rare, but recognizing them requires awareness. It requires patience. And it requires the willingness to act even when the path is not perfectly clear. Because clarity often arrives after movement, not before it. Many people wait for certainty before they begin, but growth often rewards the people who begin before certainty appears. The people who take responsibility when it is inconvenient. The people who explore challenges instead of avoiding them. The people who see possibilities where others see only problems. Those are the individuals who quietly unlock doors others never even noticed. And over time, that mindset becomes a powerful advantage. Because while others are discouraged by obstacles, you begin to recognize them as signals. Signals that something important may be hidden inside the challenge. Signals that growth is close. Signals that a new level of life may be waiting on the other side of persistence. The doorway often looks like a wall. And once you truly understand that truth, the world begins to look different. Problems become puzzles. Obstacles become invitations. Challenges become training grounds. You begin to move through life with a different kind of awareness. Not because every difficulty is easy, but because you understand that difficulty often carries hidden value. And when you combine that awareness with patience, discipline, and a strong sense of identity, you begin to develop something even more powerful: endurance. Because while many people can start the journey of growth, far fewer learn how to continue when the journey becomes long. And sometimes the greatest test of all is not pressure or doubt or delay. Sometimes the greatest test is simply continuing when progress feels slow. Continuing when recognition is absent. Continuing when the results you imagined have not yet appeared. Because real transformation often requires something deeper than motivation. It requires persistence. You have learned to recognize pressure. You have learned to grow through silence. You have continued despite doubt. You have watched your environment evolve. You have practiced patience through delay. You have reshaped your identity. You have learned to see opportunity hidden inside challenge. Now comes a test that asks a different question. Not whether you can start the journey, but whether you can continue walking when the road becomes longer than expected. Because the people who reach the highest levels are rarely the fastest. They are the ones who simply refuse to stop. Chapter 8, Test 8. The universe tests your patience. There is a quiet test that appears on nearly every meaningful journey. It does not arrive with chaos. It does not announce itself loudly. Instead, it stretches time. It slows things down. It forces you to wait longer than you expected. This test is patience. And for many people, it is one of the most difficult tests to pass. Because we live in a world that celebrates speed, fast results, quick progress, immediate success. We are surrounded by stories that make transformation look instant. But real growth rarely follows that timeline. Real growth unfolds slowly. And when the timeline stretches, something inside us begins to react. We start asking questions. Why is this taking so long? Am I doing something wrong? Should I try something else? Should I give up and move on? These questions are natural. They appear whenever expectations collide with reality. But hidden inside these moments is an important realization. Progress and patience are deeply connected. Many of the strongest foundations in life are built slowly. Think about the things that truly last. Great relationships, strong businesses, deep expertise, emotional maturity. These things rarely develop overnight. They are shaped through time, through repetition, through countless moments that look small on the surface but accumulate into something powerful. The strongest foundations take the longest to build. But patience is not simply about waiting. It is about how you think while you wait. It is about what you do during the waiting. Some people treat waiting as wasted time. They grow restless. They grow frustrated. They begin to abandon their path the moment results are not immediate. But others treat waiting as preparation. They continue learning. They continue practicing. They continue strengthening the habits and skills that will support their future success. And over time, that difference becomes significant. Because patience expands something important inside the human mind. It expands emotional stability. When you practice patience, you begin to separate temporary emotions from long-term decisions. You stop reacting to every moment of discomfort. You stop measuring progress only by immediate outcomes. Instead, you begin thinking in longer time horizons. Months instead of days. Years instead of weeks. You begin to understand that meaningful progress often happens quietly, under the surface, just like a tree growing roots beneath the soil. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening, but underground, something powerful is forming. The roots are spreading, strength is developing, stability is increasing, And when the time finally comes for visible growth, the foundation is already strong enough to support it. Many people give up during this hidden phase. They assume the absence of visible progress means failure. But those who continue during the invisible stages often experience something remarkable later. Momentum. Because when preparation meets opportunity, growth can accelerate quickly. What once felt slow suddenly moves fast. But that acceleration only happens because patience allowed the foundation to form. Without patience, the structure collapses before it ever has the chance to rise. This is why impatience can quietly sabotage potential. Impatience pushes people to abandon progress just before it begins to compound. It convinces them to change direction too quickly, to quit too early, to doubt the process before the process has time to work. And sometimes the greatest difference between those who succeed and those who stop is simply time. One group stayed with the path long enough. The other group walked away too soon. Patience is not passive. It is active endurance. It is the decision to remain committed while growth is still invisible. It is the ability to trust the process even when the timeline is unclear. It is the discipline to continue building even when applause has not yet arrived. And in many ways, patience is a form of emotional strength. Because waiting challenges the mind. Waiting exposes doubts. Waiting tests belief. But waiting also builds resilience. The more you practice patience, the less you are controlled by urgency. The more you practice patience, the more clarity you develop. You begin to recognize that not every opportunity requires immediate action. You begin to understand that some decisions benefit from reflection. You begin to appreciate the power of steady, consistent progress. Instead of rushing toward results, you begin focusing on the quality of your effort. Instead of forcing outcomes, you begin refining your process. And something interesting happens when you adopt that mindset. Your progress becomes more sustainable. Because rushed foundations crack under pressure. But patient foundations endure. Imagine building a bridge. If the builders rush the structure, skipping the careful placement of each support, the bridge may look complete quickly. But the first heavy storm will reveal its weaknesses. However, if the builders take time to strengthen every layer, reinforce every connection, and test every support, the bridge will stand for decades. Life works in a similar way. Strong foundations require time. Time to learn. Time to fail. Time to adjust. Time to become the person capable of sustaining the life you are building. The strongest foundations take the longest to build. And when you truly understand that truth, patience begins to feel less like delay and more like preparation. You stop measuring progress only by speed. You begin measuring it by depth, by resilience, by readiness. Because when the moment of opportunity finally arrives, those who use their time wisely are ready to step forward, while others are still trying to catch up. Patience transforms waiting into preparation. It transforms uncertainty into growth. It transforms time itself into an ally rather than an enemy. And this perspective changes the way you experience your journey. Instead of rushing through life searching for quick victories, you begin building something far more valuable. Durability, consistency, inner strength, the qualities that allow success to last instead of disappear. Because the goal of this journey is not simply reaching the next level quickly. The goal is becoming the kind of person who can remain there. And that kind of strength is never rushed. It is developed gradually, quietly, patiently. You have already faced many tests along this path. You endured pressure. You walked through silence. You continued despite doubt. You allowed your environment to change. You survived delays. You reshaped your identity. You learned to recognize opportunity hidden inside problems. And now you have learned to respect the power of patience. Each test has strengthened something inside you. Each lesson has prepared you for the next stage of growth. But there is still one final challenge that often determines whether transformation becomes permanent. Because even after patience is learned, another temptation can quietly appear. The temptation to prove everything to everyone, to seek validation, to explain your progress, to reveal your plans too early. And yet the most powerful growth often happens in silence. The most important progress often occurs when attention is absent, because energy protected in silence becomes focus, and focus becomes execution. You have learned patience. Now it is time to learn something even more powerful: the discipline of moving forward without needing approval. Chapter 9. Test 9. You are asked to act before you feel ready. There comes a moment on every meaningful path where a quiet but powerful question appears. Not from other people, not from the outside world, but from life itself. The question is simple. Are you willing to move before you feel ready? At first, this moment feels uncomfortable, because most of us have been taught to wait for certainty. We believe that when the right opportunity arrives, we will feel confident, prepared, completely ready. We imagine a moment where everything makes perfect sense, where every detail is clear, where the path ahead is fully visible. But life rarely works that way. In fact, some of the most important decisions people ever make happen in moments where certainty does not exist. Starting a business, changing careers, moving to a new place, pursuing a dream others do not understand, choosing growth over comfort. In nearly all of these moments, something is missing: complete readiness. And yet, the decision must still be made. The step must still be taken, because readiness is often misunderstood. Many people think readiness is a feeling that arrives before action, but the truth is something very different. Readiness is often created by action. Think about the first time you tried something new: driving a car, speaking in front of others, learning a difficult skill. In the beginning, you probably did not feel ready. There were doubts, questions, uncertainty about whether you could do it correctly. But something happened the moment you began. The moment you took the first step, the unknown started to become familiar. Your mind began gathering information. Your confidence began adjusting. Your awareness began expanding. Slowly, what once felt intimidating started to feel manageable. Not because certainty appeared first, but because movement created clarity. Movement creates clarity. This principle appears everywhere in life. The first step reveals the second. The second step reveals the third. And over time, the path becomes clearer not because you waited for perfect knowledge, but because you were willing to begin with imperfect understanding. Yet many people never experience this clarity, because they wait. They wait for the perfect plan. They wait for the perfect moment. They wait for a level of confidence that may never arrive. And during that waiting, opportunities quietly pass by, not because they lacked potential, but because hesitation delayed action long enough for the moment to disappear. This is why courage often appears before confidence. Courage is the willingness to act despite uncertainty. Confidence is what develops after repeated action. In other words, confidence is not the requirement for beginning. It is the reward for beginning. This is the hidden challenge behind the 9th test. Life places you in situations where you must choose between hesitation and movement, and the choice rarely feels comfortable. The mind begins presenting reasons to wait. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? What if this doesn't work? What if I embarrass myself? These thoughts feel convincing because they are familiar. The brain is designed to analyze risk. It wants to protect you from discomfort. But growth often exists just beyond the boundary of comfort. And sometimes the only way to discover what you are capable of is to step forward before certainty appears. This does not mean acting recklessly. It means recognizing that waiting for perfect readiness can become a form of hidden fear, a quiet delay disguised as preparation. There is a difference between thoughtful preparation and endless hesitation. Preparation strengthens your ability to act. Hesitation postpones action indefinitely. And learning to recognize that difference is a powerful skill. The people who move forward in life are not the ones who always feel ready. They are the ones who have learned to move despite uncertainty. They understand something important. Clarity often comes from experience, not speculation. You can think about a path for months. You can analyze every possibility. You can imagine every outcome. But until you take the first step, the true nature of the path remains unknown. Action reveals information that thinking alone cannot provide. Action exposes strengths you did not realize you possessed. Action teaches lessons that theory cannot replicate. Movement creates clarity. Every step forward adjusts your understanding. Every experience sharpens your awareness. Every attempt increases your capability. Even mistakes carry value. Because mistakes refine your approach. They highlight what works and what does not. They guide you toward better decisions. Without action, those lessons remain hidden. This is why so many successful people share a similar reflection when looking back at their journeys. They rarely say they felt fully prepared. Instead, they describe moments where they simply decided to begin. Moments where they trusted their willingness to learn along the way. Moments where they accepted uncertainty as part of the process. And through that willingness, they gradually developed the skills, knowledge, and confidence they once believed they needed beforehand. The process worked in reverse. Action first, confidence later. Movement creates clarity, and clarity fuels progress. But there is another important truth hidden inside this test. Taking action before feeling ready is not only about external opportunities. Sometimes it is about internal change. Speaking up when you once stayed silent. Setting boundaries where you once tolerated too much. Choosing discipline where you once chose comfort. Stepping into leadership when you once stayed in the background. These moments also require courage, because they challenge the identity you previously carried. And yet each time you act in alignment with the person you are becoming, something powerful happens. The new identity strengthens. The old limitations weaken. And the distance between who you were and who you are becoming begins to grow. You start to realize that readiness was never the true requirement. Commitment was. The willingness to move forward. The willingness to learn. The willingness to adapt. The willingness to continue even when the path is not perfectly clear. Because those who wait for certainty often remain where they started. But those who move despite uncertainty gradually build the life they imagined. Movement creates clarity, and clarity reveals the next step. You have now traveled through many stages of this journey. You have faced pressure. You have experienced silence. You have moved forward despite doubt. You have watched your environment evolve. You have endured delays. You have reshaped your identity. You have learned to recognize opportunity hidden inside problems. You have developed patience. And now you have learned one of the most powerful lessons of all. That action often comes before readiness. But the journey of transformation carries one final test. A test that determines whether all the lessons you have learned truly become part of who you are. Because growth is not proven in moments of motivation. Growth is proven in moments of consistency. When no one is watching. When excitement fades. When progress slows. When the world is quiet again. The final challenge is not beginning. The final challenge is continuing. Continuing to show up. Continuing to build. Continuing to live in alignment with the person you have worked so hard to become. You have learned to move before certainty. Now it is time to learn the ultimate discipline. The discipline of becoming the person who continues, no matter what. Chapter 10. Final test. Become the person who receives the life. The last test is different from all the others. It is not about pressure. It is not about doubt. It is not about delays, patience, or disguised opportunities. It is about you, about who you have become through every challenge you have faced. Because life does not reward ideas alone. It does not reward intentions or plans or wishes. Life responds to the person who shows up consistently, to the person who moves forward when certainty is absent, to the person who persists through delay, doubt, and resistance. This is the essence of the final test. Becoming the person who naturally receives the life you want. Not the life you hope for. Not the life you dream about. But the life that aligns with the identity you carry. Because here is the truth most people overlook. Your external world mirrors your internal self. Your reality is the reflection of the person you believe you are. The opportunities you attract. The relationships you cultivate. The success you create. They are all shaped by your identity. And this is where the identity upgrade loop becomes crucial. It is the principle that underpins every transformation you have experienced so far. When your identity evolves, your decisions evolve. When your decisions evolve, your behavior evolves. When your behavior evolves, your results evolve. And the cycle continues, reinforcing itself until who you are inside becomes visible outside. This is why the final stage of growth is rarely dramatic. It is subtle. It is quiet. It happens in small, consistent choices that reinforce the person you are becoming. Saying no when you once said yes. Taking responsibility when you once avoided it. Acting decisively when you once hesitated. And over time, these choices create a new baseline for who you are. Your past limitations fade because you no longer identify with them. Your old fears lose their grip because you no longer define yourself by them. Your old patterns dissolve because you have replaced them with behaviors consistent with your new identity. This is why external success is rarely the first indicator of transformation. You may not feel dramatically different at first. The world may not recognize the changes immediately. But the person who receives opportunities, relationships, and success is not the person the world sees. They are the person who has quietly evolved internally. Your reality changes when your identity changes. And this final test is not a one-time moment. It is a lifelong process. Because life will always present challenges that call for the next iteration of who you are. The pressures will return in new forms. Doubt will arrive in new disguises. Opportunities will appear cloaked as obstacles. And each time, your response will reflect the identity you have built. The person who has learned to endure, to persist, to act before readiness, to move silently, and to embrace opportunity hidden in challenge is the person who naturally navigates these tests. The person who becomes who they decided to be receives the life they were always capable of living. This is the culmination of everything you have learned. Pressure teaches resilience. Silence teaches awareness. Doubt teaches courage. Change teaches identity. Patience teaches endurance. Disguised opportunity teaches perception. Action before readiness teaches initiative. Silent progress teaches consistency. And all of it together upgrades the person you are. Not to impress the world. Not to achieve fleeting success, but to align completely with the life you were always meant to lead. Because the world responds to identity. Opportunities, relationships, and results all flow naturally to those who are ready, not just in skill, but in character. You are no longer reacting to life. You are living it intentionally. You are not just passing tests anymore. You are embodying the person capable of sustaining the reality you desire. And that is the ultimate mastery. You mastered pressure. You mastered silence. You mastered doubt, delay, and hidden opportunity. You mastered patience, persistence, and action. And now you have mastered identity. Your life reflects it. Your results reflect it. Your future is aligned with it. And so, as this journey concludes, ask yourself, who are you choosing to be from this moment forward? Because that person will define every decision. That person will shape every relationship. That person will create every opportunity. And that person will receive the life you were always capable of living. The final test is complete, and your reality begins anew. Your reality changes when your identity changes. Now go and live as the person you have decided to become. You have passed the ultimate test. The journey continues, but the power has always been within you. In closing, if you've listened this far, something important has already happened. You've started seeing your life differently. Moments that once felt random begin to reveal a pattern. The obstacles, the delays, the uncertainty, they were never just problems. They were tests, not punishments. Preparation. Because every major transformation in life asks the same question. Are you ready to become someone new? Most people wait for life to change before they change themselves. But the people who transform their reality understand something deeper. Life begins responding differently when you start responding differently. When difficulty appears and you stay steady. When doubt appears and you keep moving. When delays appear and you remain patient. When opportunity appears disguised as effort and you accept it anyway. Those moments quietly reshape your identity. An identity is the most powerful force directing your future. The world does not simply respond to what you want. It responds to who you are becoming. So the next time life feels challenging, pause for a moment. Ask yourself a different question. Not, why is this happening to me? But, is this one of the tests? Because if it is, then this moment is not the end of your progress. It is the doorway to your next level. So here is your challenge. From this moment forward, treat every difficulty as preparation. Treat every delay as alignment. Treat every challenge as a signal that something larger may be forming. And most importantly, keep becoming the person who is ready when that moment arrives. Because when you pass the tests, reality begins to move, and your next chapter begins.